Even better with my microphone turned on. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live. It's nice to have you with us tonight on another special edition of Epstein Untold. We're going to talk a lot about Robert Maxwell's life today. As you know, his life could have filled many novels, in fact, has filled many novels. But the story of a Czech refugee who climbs to the pinnacle of British society as the publisher of the Mirror is unlikely a tale as it sounds. The fact that he was also a super spy, an arms trader, whose side hustle was negotiating the collapse of the Soviet Union seems even more unlikely. But also, the story remains true. That part does indeed. But even that isn't quite the whole story. 1 second. As we'll reveal today, there's much more connecting Robert Maxwell to Jeffrey Epstein and to Ghislaine Maxwell than meets the eye. You can't really understand one of the stories, can understand Robert Maxwell's story without understanding the Jeffrey Epstein story, and vice versa. In fact, you could argue that the Jeffrey Epstein saga is in actuality the second part of the Robert Maxwell story. And that is how the show is going to go. We're going to break down all these different possible connections and see where we land. I'm joined by our fantastic panel, Greg Oliar, I think I said it correctly, of Prevail and other great writing enterprises, including many best-selling novels. And Lincoln Bible is here, and Eric Garland is here. Hello to both of you again. Welcome back to Narrative Live. So let's talk a little bit about the news of the day. We have a whole show planned, but we should touch a little bit about revelations today that it seems that Ehud Barak, who's been previously linked to Jeffrey Epstein, is now being named in one of the lawsuits against for sexually abusing Virginia Giffrey, who's the original or one of the original victims in the Epstein saga. None of this is truly surprising, although it is unusual to see a former Israeli prime minister named in a suit like that. Anyone want to pick that up?
Not just former prime minister, but also former equivalent of the Secretary of Defense, their Minister of Defense Forces, and head of military intelligence. So, yes, weird.
As we found out, when I went to speak to Ari Ben Menashe over a year ago, Ehud Barak was part of the blackmailing scheme. He was the guy who was picking up all the dirty tapes and putting them somewhere else, returning them to whoever wanted them, I guess. They had their blackmail drop-off center. It's clear that he was part of the operation. He was actually a key element of that. Now, on top of that, he's potentially an abuser of one of these young women. That's a phenomenal thing to happen, again, for a former Israeli prime minister. The way we found out is through Alan Dershowitz. And I don't know if any of you can explain to our audience how that happened today. Okay. LB, are you there? I feel like I'm missing you. I can't hear you. That's why I can't.
Maybe nobody just wants to talk about Alan Dershowitz because it's too uncomfortable.
It's because I haven't pressed the right buttons yet again. This is my bane of my existence. But you're there now. I hear you now.
I'm here now. Well, Dershowitz has been, we all follow a great court reporter named Adam Classfield, and he was in there. And I don't know how they're doing it virtually, I guess, with the COVID. But he was, giving us sort of a beat by beat of what the arguments were, because Dershowitz been trying to get his hands on some depositions, I guess. Eric, is that correct? Are they depositions? It's court testimony that's sealed, and he thinks it's pertaining to him, and he's claiming this is going to clear me of these charges, because he's actually been accused by two different women than girls, I believe. And so he keeps saying this is about him. And then what was interesting is today, Julie K. Brown smacked back on Twitter saying, she kind of had an understanding of what was in there, and Alan wasn't named. And all that became very confusing, all these back and forths going on Twitter. But what was happening in the court was just, is this guy going to have the right to, Dershowitz, he wanted to be able to, quote unquote, defend himself against these allegations. And so therefore I need to see this stuff. Well, if he's not really, if there's other people involved in this and not him, I'm very curious why Alan Dershowitz really wants to get his hands on this information and what he plans on doing with it. And if it turns out that Ehud Barak is actually in there, that might be a reason.
Right.
It's very unclear because he also is the one that helped shut this all down on Jeffrey's behalf, and he's the one who crafted the whole co-conspirator. You can't go after any co-conspirators agreements with then Acosta. Dershowitz has been deeply involved in this thing in very weird, non-lawyerly, non-professional, like not the way that lawyers behave ways, right? Hiring Black Cube, all of this stuff that's to go follow the witnesses and the girls and the victims, calling the victims teenage prostitutes, where technically you can't, you're not a prostitute if you're underage. That's rape. So he's the one who crafted all of that bullshit around that, and he, for some reason, feels entitled to get his hands on information that the court never saw fit. And Ghislaine Maxwell is the one that was fighting that, her attorney fighting.
Oh, that's right.
Having any of this get turned over.
It's really interesting that they're also victimizing Virginia Giffey again, who, she doesn't want this information out necessarily in the way it's being handed out. And yet here she is a second time, finding her name in the headlines in a way that she may not want to be associated right now. So it's kind of bizarre that this has gone public. I mean, I sure understand why Alan Dershowitz gets to see the stuff to prepare his defense, but it doesn't make sense that it's been released publicly.
I want to follow on what Lincoln's Bible's talking about with what I call non-economic behavior in the intelligence field, which is anybody who's not acting in accordance with their own normal interests, or also the Avenatti rule, like, why is this guy on television tainting all these jury pools if he's really representing a client, as opposed to sitting in the background and filing appropriate things, which is what most attorneys do. They don't go and take 128 different television spots. Dershowitz is absolutely not acting like an attorney, much like Ehud Barak. When you put it the way we've seen in some of the photos, where he's sneaking in the side door to come out with an armload of sex tapes. It's really, if you've been head of an intelligence agency, it's not to say that you've never done a gig as an operative before, but generally you don't, as former Secretary of Defense, Minister of Defense, head of an intel thing, you don't go pick up the bag of compromising tapes yourself.
Generally not.
With all the cameras pointing at you. I mean, it just seems like, and the Israelis are really good at this stuff, right? So don't they hire somebody?
Have it both ways. It's one of those you can't have it both ways moments.
You
can't be really, really good at this and then clowning around with a scarf of smuts on your head and covering your face.
What are
you doing?
But I'm former Minister of Defense for Israel, but it's okay. I'll sneak in the side door. They'll never find me. That doesn't seem credible to me.
He once took down an entire PLO cell, I think, dressed in drag. So this is definitely a come down operationally from what he previously done.
I could be wrong.
I
could be wrong.
He definitely done that. It's not his finest moments, that's for sure.
Not his finest fashion moment.
All right, so that's the other one big news today. We've got lots to talk about in terms of Jeffrey Berman and what's happening at the SDNY. We're going to do that in the next hour, because what I'd like to do is focus a little bit on Robert Maxwell. And in order to do that, I need to, I was going to play lots of good 80s music, but apparently I can't, because I'll be charged for playing all the good 80s music. The bad 80s music is still available, but it didn't quite make sense. So we're going to go back to the 1980s in a different way. This was the year 1984, when, believe it or not, the Macintosh came out. And it came out with an ad that was pretty relevant to what we're talking about today. And it was relevant in this way. Take a look at the ad and we'll follow up in a second.
One cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, but we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
So, of course, 1984 was like 1984. It turns out to be the beginning of the entire surveillance capitalism, whatever you want to call it, era that we're in right now, where every little bit of data is tracked on you and everything is marketed to you in a specific way. Your entire life seems to be in the hands of a Facebook, Google, or anybody else. And it's kind of smart of Apple to be sitting there and saying, it's not really 1984 when, in fact, they are introducing the very thing Orwell spoke about. And the reason why it's important to this story is because it relates to this thing called Promise, which I know you guys know about, which was a software created in the Department of Justice initially to track criminals going through the court system. And what they discovered, or at least maybe the original intention, was for them to create a mass surveillance database tool that they could then spread around the world. I'm going to explain it to you in a quick little piece of tape, and then we'll be right back to talk about the implications for our dystopian society. Here we go. Promise made it possible for prosecutors to track any case through the US court systems. The underlying code was truly pioneering. Promise allowed data from different databases to be combined into a single data set for analysis. At the time, there was just simply nothing like it for tracking people, money, and cargo. So, decades before Edward Snowden revealed the NSA was spying on basically everybody, American intelligence already had the software to do it. Ronald Reagan believed Promise was his secret weapon to bring down the Soviet Union. But how do you get Promise into the hands of the Russians? Well, in 1983, or so the story goes, Rafi Eitan, an Israeli spy master operating under a pseudonym, stole a copy of Promise from its creator, Bill Hamilton of Inslaw. Eitan gave the software to Ari Ben-Menashe, his partner in the spy ring, also from Israeli military intelligence, and then he gave it to Robert Maxwell, the British media tycoon and double KGB and Israeli agent, who gave it to the Russians. Hamilton and Ben-Menashe blew the lid off the spy caper on Australian TV.
He allowed the CIA to spy on the intelligence agencies that bought it.
So many people in the last 10 years, due to cover-ups, died mysteriously.
Modifications that enabled it to key in a special access code and gain entry to all the information on the computer.
It would be equivalent to reading the handwritten files of all the agents, except the computer has them neatly organized and typed and instantly indexed, so it's much more convenient.
So what a tool that they gave the NSA developed it, we believe, for themselves, and they then sold it to the Russians with an attempt to spy on the Russians. The Russians figured out how to reverse engineer it, and they in turn spied back on the Americans, and the same thing happened with the Chinese. And the guy who was handling all of this, for some reason, was the publisher of the Daily Mirror, because that's what one would do, right? You'd go to the publisher of the Daily Mirror to sell spy software. And it's 1984. It's the tipping point of all our data nightmares, and Maxwell is the guy running the ship. Anyone want to pick up on that one?
Just real quick.
Yeah.
Promise, I found out, prepping for this, is an acronym, and it stands for Prosecutors Management Information Systems, which I did not know, even though we've talked about this a lot. And I think that harkens back to its original purpose, which was the sort of Department of Justice database.
Yeah, it was intended for that. I don't know. Well, that's what they claimed it was.
That was its cover story.
Yeah.
That was its
But
import-export
it was still
shop.
doing that. That's incredible, right? So, when you consider that what goes through the Department of Justice, that you have counterintelligence investigations, you have criminal organized crime investigations, you have all of our fucketeers in there, right?
Right.
One way or another, if they're breaking laws, and that goes through Bank of New York, the banks in New York, or our banking system, or involves individuals on U.S. soil. I would like to have that if I'm a fucketeer overseas and I want to see what might be the tracking going on. What about witness protection? Oh my gosh, maybe I want that if I'm a mobster. So, it's a hell of a thing to have your eyes into. It's if you're a criminal, it's or a spy. That's like, it's candy. Oh my God.
Yeah, it is candy.
And there's another use here that reminds me of Robert Hansen, the trader who's at ADX Florence. You can also see with that kind of software who's looking into what, when, and what nailed Hansen, I come to understand, was he was looking his own name up in the FBI counterintelligence database a little too often for someone who was not concerned about being picked up as a KGB spy. It's like Robert Hansen.
Right.
Robert Hansen.
And then
they're like, Well, Bob, what's up, Bob? And that put him on the trail. And so Promise would do that. If you have dirty prosecutors, which they've had for years, of course, that's why we have the Rule 48A that you can't get rid of Flynn's prosecution with just a dirty Bill Barr. That's why they have that, because you pay off prosecutors and attorneys general and all that. It happens. And this would let you know who's poking into cases that they're not supposed to be.
Yeah.
So if you're got dirty prosecutors and mobsters and spies, you can find your rats in there. So this is now the Hall of Mirrors. Everybody just spying on everybody for spying.
It really was. It really was. It was this kind of thing where suddenly everybody was spying on everybody else, and everyone suddenly the entire planet is covered with the data information surveillance tool. It was done by Senator John Towers was the guy, or Tower, I should say. He was a senator from Texas who was going to be the defense secretary later in his life for all the good work he had done in being sort of the KGB and Israeli spy handler in the United States. And it was he who approached Maxwell first to start brokering the Promise software around the world. I don't know if you remember that this thing called Berlitz schools in the 1980s where you could go learn different languages. We had it in South Africa. I'm sure it didn't exist as much in the United States, but it's basically an intelligence front to some extent. And what Maxwell did is
absolutely an intelligence front.
he used it as a way to market this Promise software around the world, pocketing a good commission from each one. And ultimately, it was Robert Gates who was in charge of that whole project, who's still very powerful today and has been in many cabinets. And Rafi Eitan, the guy we saw just a little earlier on, that convinced Maxwell this was the thing to do. Now, it's unusual for a publisher of a newspaper. So clearly, this guy is more than that. He's a spy, obviously, as we've discovered many times. But this is a really unusual set of circumstances. LB, any thoughts on that?
Oh, I mean, look, this was terrible. And he was also. It's hard to nail the date when Robert Maxwell started doing his business entities and partnerships with Mogilevich, Semyon Mogilevich, who was a big Ukrainian Soviet-born Soviet era, still alive, but not what he was in his heyday in the 90s, really rising up. With the fall of the Soviet Union to consolidate all the different Rotvas. I mean, there were several mafias, families going on in the Soviet Union. He just happened to be head of the biggest one, Solnitskaya, which was called the Rising Sun sometimes, and or the brain inside of it. And he was a massive money launderer, a brilliant guy. And before kind of ascending to that hierarchy within the underworld, while still being a gangster, he was partnered with Robert Maxwell and introduced, I think, by Soviet military intelligence head of counterintel. But anyway, so Maxwell's running around with that guy too. And, we do know that he got his hands on Promise as well. So probably from Maxwell.
This is Semyon Mogilevich.
This is Semyon Mogilevich, right?
Yeah.
Do we know?
Maxwell, yeah. Go ahead.
Do we know when Maxwell acquired control of the Bulgarian Cooperative Bank? That would be the year. This is in the Craig Unger book.
89. Right. I believe it was 88, 89. Yeah. I'd have to look at
it's
the book.
It's the lone reference
later.
to Robert Maxwell in the Craig Unger book.
Right. The late 80s in the Ungers puts Maxwell running this Bulgarian, like $2 billion of flight capital he was able to push through that Bulgarian bank. Also, at the sort of direction and request of Khrushchev, the head of the counterintelligence at the KGB. That sounds stupid. Like the guy at the KGB who was responsible for making the spies everywhere. So spies that we have, and spies elsewhere, that was his directorate, that he was head of that. And he was Robert Maxwell's really good buddy. I mean, they sent gifts to each other. They kissed each other on the cheek when they met each other. This was his.
He had a lot of friends in the KGB.
He had a lot of friends in the KGB.
For a guy who just came from Czechoslovakia, he had quite a lot of friends in different places in KGB. He was born, so this is the official storyline, he said he was born Ludwig Koch in Czechoslovakia. And then this is what Britannica says about him. He was one of the richest men in Great Britain and the head of a powerful publishing empire. It leaves out all these sort of essential details that you'd want to add in there, like the fact that he, stole $800 million from the CIA, 450 million pounds from pensioners. He's six aliases. Can you believe that? And he's worked on 3 intelligence agencies because he worked for the KGB, the Israeli military intelligence, and also MI6. And MI9 actually in 14, but let's say those 3 are just all the same ones. So what we know about Robert Maxwell is actually vastly incorrect. There's also the fact that we don't know his real name. Now, I know, Eric, you know a lot about the region he was born in, which is the Carpathian Mountains in the eastern part of Slovenia, I think.
It's in Ukraine. It's in Ukraine now. It was Slovakia.
It's now in Ukraine.
It's like the hot potato of Eastern Europe. Everyone gets a chance to own it for a little bit.
Okay, so LB likes it when I do this. He's a spy. The story's complete hokum. I did the background research. Like, this guy's Czech. His name's Jan, but now he's going to take Robert. And then you look through the article in Russian. Not that I speak it at all, but you look at it, his name's Mikhail. So he's like a Michael. But they loved his accent. I'm like, in what language did they like his accent? Is he Czech? Is he Slovak? Because that's in Ukraine now. And even back then, when it was in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, it was a Ukrainian-speaking region that had just broken away for 10 months in 1919. And I'm like, this is the perfect place to put a spy where no one could ever say where he's from. There's no record of anything because first of all, you never have 6 names, right? For most of us, maybe, you were Greaser or Chucky or whatever your name is in high school, but you have 1 or 2 names max, right? 6 is excessive. So anyways, the whole thing's, yeah.
And he's supposedly a friend of Brezhnev, supposedly a friend of Cherbikov, who's one of the KGB leaders, and also a friend of Gorbachev. Now, that's unlikely too, really, when you think about a guy from Czechoslovakia suddenly befriending the entire leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, but apparently he was able to. So to settle the score here, we should just say he's a KGB spy first and foremost. A lot of people like to think of him as all these other things, but he really is a KGB agent from birth almost. It seems like there was not much that we know about him before that would have made him anything other than a KGB spy and from Russia. LB, you must have some thoughts about that. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Greg.
Quick, can I just, quick, the British Foreign Office in the file, this is written in the 1950s, called him a thoroughly bad character, almost certainly financed by Russia. That was pretty soon after the war, so.
Not long. And then the FBI file on him it's fun. You should go, everyone should go to the FBI vault and read about Robert Maxwell. There's still a lot redacted. But, they were following him with his Pergamon Press and all his sort of machinations as a publisher, and his partners who all, ended up, okay, here's a CIA guy and there's a guy over there. And then, it's just all loaded with all these gross characters at all points in time, or good guys trying to get in there and figure out what is this guy up to now, right? I think there's a lot of question about who was helping him and how much help did he get and why he did get kind of messy with the money. Like, what happened?
He just wanted it. He liked it.
He wanted it. He liked it. He spent it. He behaved as if he was royal. He was a very odd duck. So
I actually think the money situation is a really interesting thing because, as I pointed out at the start of the show, what we're trying to show today is that there is a continuation from Maxwell into Epstein. And the money, as far as we could tell last week from Stephen Hoffenberg, who was on the show, went to Epstein through Towers Financial. So we don't know how much there was, but there's probably $1 billion worth of cash that went to Epstein to finance his operation, which was a continuation of Robert Maxwell's operation. And we know this also through Steve's telling us last week that, before recently, no one really knew what happened between 1981 and 1987 with Epstein. He sort of fell off the map. There was no real details about where he was working. He appeared here and there, but there was no real direction from anybody about what he was actually doing. Now, Steve came along and provided us brand new details because he revealed that Epstein was working for this guy named Sir Julian Leese, or Douglas Leese. Sir Douglas Leese. Julian is his son. And Douglas Leese is nothing short of the arms trader to the Queen herself and the Crown of the UK. And so it's interesting that during those 8 years, what he was doing was living in London, training to be Maxwell's heir apparent. And this was all part of a plan that Douglas Leese came up with. And so we know now that that's where Ghislaine met Jeffrey. And they were able to begin this relationship, which would then, father approved and various others approved. Finally, the Israeli military intelligence gave it their green light. And there was a big plan to take this operation from Maxwell's years into a second generation, which I think people really struggle with this idea that there's a second generation of an operation like this. But it's not that unusual, I think, in these countries that have a longer term memory than the Americas.
I mean, a few decades isn't that long for most cultures. I mean, things have moved very quickly because of nuclear weapons. Principally, we changed the nature of warfare in a few short years. Basic military strategy and tactics had not fundamentally changed since Caesar, really. Right. Battlefield medicine had not improved from Galen to World War I. Nukes in a few short years changes everything. And so now that feels like a long time, but it's really not, because you're only talking about a couple of generations of money to accumulate in a system that does interest and then shift it to a bank. So no, this, I think we all feel a little bit weird about going back to 1984 and going, no, that was a long time ago. I had X amount of hair more, or, this many fewer wrinkles or whatever, but it wasn't that long ago. We're just used to thinking of our own lives.
And it was the heyday of our now president. And so we should really get to know that decade inside and out, and who was screwing over America. I like that's what my focus is, right?
Well, because that's the ultimate goal, right?
That's right.
The plan is not to do nice things to America. The plan is to destroy America, or at least weaken it significantly.
So.
So if Maxwell started it,
or control it, just control it, to have your hooks in to the big, shining city on the hill. Let's that was stated by Ari Ben-Menashe as well in your interview, and I think, not that we're trying to rest everything on one or two sources, but it's pretty well sort of meted out across many, many sources of, there was a lot of nervousness always with when we have a change in administration, when we might have a change in direction. Everybody gets a little nervous that are both our friends and our enemies, and want to make sure that they've got their hooks in where they need it so that they get what they want with whatever changes we install as a democracy, right?
Right.
So if they can get a really corrupt money launderer in there, right, and completely own that guy and leverage anything they want out of him, including just making us look terrible, making us look like a shithole so that their propaganda works with their people who they're worried about, then that's a win. It can be that simple when it comes to Putin, even though we know it's much more complicated. Or a friend saying, maybe we did some things with Epstein and Ehud Barak, and maybe they were taped, and maybe that we were part of that because we were concerned about Bill Clinton. And so maybe, let's not let that get out, because God forbid it gets out that our friends were actually behind the industrial scale rape of our daughters in order that they could make sure they had their hooks into us in the way that they wanted to and needed to.
You mentioned Ari Ben-Menashe.
It's a dark story.
It is a very dark story.
It's a dark story, and the 80s were a dark chapter.
And so you mentioned Ari Ben-Menashe because he's the second person who confirmed what basically Steve Hoffenberg confirmed to me. So
right.
There are not many people who are up close to these people back in the 1980s who are available to talk to us these days. But Steve Hoffenberg and Ari Ben-Menashe are two of those people who are pretty close. Ari Ben-Menashe was Maxwell's handler. He handled a lot of the Iran-Contra buying and selling of weapons to Iran and whoever else they were doing the arms trades with. And I want to play you just a short clip from his interview where he describes the relationship between Maxwell and Epstein, which kind of confirms everything Steve Hoffenberg said. So take a listen.
Maxwell introduced him to us, and he wanted us to accept him as part of our group. I'd like you to work with him. After talking to him a bit, it didn't take too long.
You just didn't think he had the...
No.
So what did he do? Can you say what he did for you? Or like what kind of work did you guys do together?
No, he didn't do anything.
Oh, so you met him and that was it?
I met him a few times in Maxwell's office. And Maxwell sort of started liking him. Maxwell felt that this guy is going for his daughter.
Right. He felt like he could bless him with some work and help him out, and like it felt paternal.
That Maxwell introduced.
Okay, it just keeps going. That was the second part. The first part again, but you get a sense of where Maxwell shows up with Epstein, already blessed by the Israeli military intelligence brass, and says, "Hey, this is my new guy. This is my number two. Who's going to be marrying my daughter." That seems to be like the two pieces of evidence now that from Steve Hoffenberg and Ari Ben-Menashe suggesting that there was in fact a deliberate handover, a deliberate plan to take the operation from Maxwell's hands into the hands of Jeffrey Epstein.
I'm glad you mentioned it about when they met, when Jeffrey Epstein met Ghislaine, because the official story is that they met after her father died and she came to New York. But it sort of makes more sense that they would have met in the mid-'80s when she was still of the age that would have, attracted his attention. I mean,
indeed, yeah, she was only 20, I think, when they met, and he was 27 or something. But there was an absolutely, I think that's true. And Ari Ben-Menashe also talks about Maxwell liking a lot of younger girls as well, and that he and Epstein actually bonded over that, which is kind of creepy and weird in many ways. But it's this is what we're dealing with here.
Well, what is the difference between a sex offender and an intelligence operative is probably $800 million stolen from the CIA and a fortune inherited from your girlfriend's dad, who was described by MI6 as a dodgy guy who's financed by Russia. I mean, otherwise, it's just that gross math teacher at high school. Add $1 billion,
and you're just a finance whiz. He just is a whiz with all the finances.
He's so good at math, and he's charming.
So good at math. And he wears that Harvard
and that's why
sweatshirt.
Israeli intelligence. I mean, who is more charmed more easily than Mossad?
Yeah.
You just show up and it's like he's telling jokes and limericks and he's good at calculus, and we're just like, all right, put him in charge of compromising all of the Congress and all that.
Yeah, he was a spy. I like the fact that they always say he's so incompetent.
Brave people, it's not hard. Just get it.
He's a spy.
He's a spy. Clearly.
Jesus.
You got two spies here, and
he's a pedophile.
Yeah. But he's also
a pedophile with $1 billion who can sell you missiles.
He's doing a lot of things. Yeah, he's selling missiles. Basically, that was his key priority.
And a lot of recording equipment in every single home. So, somehow he had the wizardry to wire that all up himself.
They keep saying he's incompetent, right? They keep saying he wasn't very capable. Ari Ben-Menashe kept saying this to me, and I was like, if he's so incapable, how did he get away with this for, I don't know, 30 years? I mean, he must be doing something right.
This is the thing that bothers me. This bothers me to no end of this. He was just a coffee boy.
Yeah.
I can't take it. This is my breaking point. Because, again, this is where you press on that. That's clearly coming out of an intelligence narrative, right? Of our allies, of our friend, right? So you're saying to me, this is when it's like your dick is out, and I get upset about that, right? Don't tell me I'm not seeing what I'm seeing, right? I see it. It's out. Don't tell me it's not out. So you're telling me that Jeffrey Epstein was able to have this mysterious wealth, right? Connected to arms transactions, masterminding Ponzi schemes. All of this is on the record. None of this is, right? None of this is, I'm not pulling this out of my ass. This isn't some conspiracy. It's all fucking there. There's court cases, for Christ's sake. So he did all of this. He had islands, he had planes, right? He had a girlfriend, pimp, whatever, whose dad was the biggest spy you've ever had. And she's flying helicopters and piloting submarines. And all of this shit is going down. He's able to manipulate the system in a way. He's got all kinds of prosecutors and law enforcement in his pocket. He is underdealing, and his attorneys are coming in, and they're leveraging the Department of Justice to get him off for mass rape, mass scale, industrial scale rape. We know there's recording equipment in every single orifice of this guy's life. So he's able to pull all of that off for over a decade and escape prosecution, pretty much, right? Escape the law. And seducing ex-presidents and ambassadors and all this seduction and all the celebrities and everything, and fly all over the world and set up philanthropical operations at institutions like Harvard and MIT and swing with the big academic minds and get into the tech sector and fund gaming shit with the Chinese and have all that shit going on, while simultaneously with Ehud Barak starting up, private Israeli defense spying services with carbon, all this shit. He's able to do all of that, but he's an incompetent? Okay. So then I'm going to go with you. I'm going to go with he's an incompetent. You win that. I'm going to give that to the Ari Ben Menashe's of the world and everybody that you've talked to, Zev, that I've talked to, that keeps covering for this guy and saying, oh, he really just didn't know what he was doing. Oh, he really was just this coffee boy, right? Yeah, he was, he like young girls. I'm going to go with that. He didn't know what he was doing. So who did? Right. Who did? Who helped him? If he didn't know what he was doing, then how did he pull all that off? How did all that happen? Mm-hmm. Who did that for him? And once you push on that button, you push these guys into that corner, they're going to have to come up with an answer.
That's a very big network of people ultimately who knew about this and who kept their mouths shut for 30 years and in fact stopped the wheels of justice from turning, because this guy could have been in jail several times over the amount of times he had almost been indicted and almost been convicted. Even the one time he sort of had that 6-month stay at a Holiday Inn prison, but he's been able to get away with literal murder in some cases, and also many other crimes over 3 decades, and largely because is it Prince Andrew who was there knocking on the doors of the prosecutor saying make him a deal, or who was it who was making all these deals, allowing him to not only get off with the crimes he committed, but allow him to continue to commit the crimes that he was doing.
I think that the fact that he did all the sex trafficking for as long as he did and as horrible as it got actually is an argument that he was super competent and did all the stuff himself, because otherwise why would they keep him around? If he was incompetent, that makes him a liability in a sense. I know he used the girls to get compromat and stuff like that, but my sense is that the primary purpose for him was that he enjoyed it and he got off on it. So why would you empower somebody like that and let them get away with this shit for as long as he did, unless he was almost singularly good at what he did? That's what I would argue.
And I mean, absolutely. I think it's impossible. I don't know how to work. I don't know how to work a Ponzi scheme.
Well, tell that to the Israeli military intelligence officers, right?
Yeah.
They're going to have to pick a story.
They need a better story.
They need to pick a story about this guy.
Yeah.
Because the incompetent coffee boy doesn't play.
Doesn't fly at all.
That's insane. I mean, from a very
he was a
early
coffee
age,
boy.
Before he's even involved with any of this stuff, he gets the job at Dalton. Does he know anybody coming out of Cooper Union at that point? I mean, I don't think he was made in a lab to be this way. So he must have charmed Donald Barr, and Barr saw something in him that made him want to hire him.
This guy is a blackmailer. He knew how to blackmail. He knew how to blackmail to get what he wanted.
Yep, that was his thing. That was one of his.
That's
his
my
key
book on
competences.
Epstein.
Yeah,
that's my book on Epstein. Arms dealing fucketeer who knew how to blackmail to get what he wanted. The end.
Okay.
But even when he's like, how old was he when he went to work at Dalton? 20?
Yeah, it was.
It said in the documentary he skipped 2 years of high school and he went to college for a year. So
Yeah.
I mean, how much blackmail power could he have had at that time? I'm only saying I think
Well,
he's
you're
a
in there with
charming guy.
you're in there with the young kids and who are the children of very powerful men.
I'm not saying once he's
Donald
there
Barr,
yet. I'm saying before he got there.
How did he get in there?
He got in the door. Yeah. So he had to have had some natural ability.
Right. We can go into his family in Coney Island at another time. I'm not sure that was ability. I think it was because he was somebody's kid.
Look, Donald Barr was also a spy, and there's a clear history, and so was Bill Barr. So there's definitely a CIA thread flowing through this entire storyline, and it seems more likely that he's probably working with the CIA while handling the Dalton School stuff than anything else to me, because otherwise, how did he get the job, and why did Ace Greenberg forgive the fact that he didn't have the credentials and then hired him to Bear Stearns? You know, having it became known
and then
already.
Handed him Edgar Bronfman.
Yeah, the biggest client he had.
Bronfman?
Yeah, it doesn't happen. Doesn't
happen that way. But let's move out of all that, because that ends up. Yeah. I feel like that bogs down people in theory instead of us really looking at what happened in the 80s around Robert Maxwell that it directly implicates everything that we've got going on today, especially the Bill Barr stuff, especially this Attorney General.
That's a good point. So, sorry, go ahead, Eric. Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, and also, you can get mired in all the details, and at some point you have to go, they're spies. But there's another question we need to ask about this period. This isn't the only spy by a long shot. Who else is a long-term deep cover agent here? Who has been acting on some hostile foreign powers' behalf since the 70s and 80s? What happened during the Reagan administration? Because when you see this, the Mr. X group there that includes Doug Feith and Frank Gaffney that were in the Reagan White House who turn out as part of the Iraq War in such critical roles, and then beyond that, to just drive the Republican Party or American foreign policy in a certain direction, you go, okay, you guys are all part of this same group here. Are you a cell? Who are you working for?
You're jumping ahead. You're jumping ahead, Eric. I'm gonna. Sorry, we'll get there in just a minute, because I just want to make a couple of points before we leave 1984, because we're still there, believe it or not. So at the same time as all of this was going on, the Ari Ben-Menashe and Maxwell had started their little front to sell weapons to the Iranians. It was called Aura Limited, and a regular visitor there, as you'd heard from Ari Ben-Menashe, was Epstein. So for those people who question whether they had anything to do with the 1980s, whether Epstein was really involved with Maxwell in the 1980s, there's one more thing I want to point everyone to, and that is that, because of his friend Khashoggi, Adnan Khashoggi, it appears that Jeffrey Epstein was the other person who had Promise Software, because that's what one did in the 80s, apparently. And so Khashoggi was licensed the Promise Software in order to sell to the Sultan of, I can't really read, the Sheikh Khalid over there. And you see there's an actual letter from the Department of Justice. And this was an incredible coincidence, I guess, that Epstein and Maxwell both had their hands on the most sophisticated surveillance software in the world, and were at least brokering it through a partner of Epstein in Adnan Khashoggi. That to me seems like a very significant clue that Epstein and Maxwell were not only working together, that there was a continuity, and that it stretches back all the way back to the early 80s. I don't know if anyone wants to pick that up.
Oh, I so want to pick this up, but I want to pick it up with Iran-Contra.
Okay.
Go back to that slide. Okay. So that Manager Gobanoffer, let me just, I hadn't seen this. If you show this to me, for some reason, that name didn't pop out to me before.
He's a big arms dealer. He's Adnan Khashoggi's right-hand guy.
He's a huge arms dealer. So this same group, right, especially Gorbunoffer and Adnan Khashoggi, but specifically Gorbunoffer, is deeply, deeply, deeply in the Iran-Contra arms dealing.
Yeah,
that's the guy that executed the actual sale of arms from, and was the middleman that helped the transaction of us selling arms through Israel to Iran during that Iraq-Iran war. I did not know that he was in here with the promise stuff.
He's not only is in there with the promise stuff, that's the connection to Epstein having this tool to go and use it in Ponzi schemes around the world and what have you, while Maxwell also sold it to various intelligence agencies. So it's a significant piece of evidence that people tend to gloss over. But the fact that this tool was probably used to launder so much money and to track people, God knows what else was used for in the United States, it was really shocking to me that this has received so little play, and how people just disregard this little piece of evidence, which is, surely very significant. So I'm going to just jump here to this Iran-Contra, because we should move on to 1985. The rest goes by quite quickly. Yeah. These are the guys. So Nicholas Davies, you see next to the Iran-Contra exposed there. He was the foreign editor of the Mirror. He was part of this crew that Ari Ben-Menashe put together. And there's Robert Maxwell. They created this company called Aura. They were moving weapons back and forth around the world. The guy on I guess it's the upper left from the way I'm looking at it, is Cherbikov. He's the KGB head at the time. Maxwell and Cherbikov have a fantastic relationship, as it turns out, because he's a KGB spy. You could probably explain that pretty easily. And what Maxwell and Cherbikov land up doing is negotiating the end of the Soviet Union. Nothing less than that big, spectacular, the thunderous news story that happened in the late 1980s, early 90s. The end of the Soviet Union was created by a KGB agent, Robert Maxwell, and Cherbikov, the head of the KGB. Ta-da!
Well, it's just completely changing all of
I thought you were going to play a tape.
No, it's okay.
I
like the silence. I like the silence.
Yeah.
The aristocrats.
They were looking at it. Well, I mean, I feel like, so do you want to connect around what Iran-Contra was? I do feel like people need a refresher on that.
Yeah, go ahead. If you
because I think all that ends up being stuck in people's heads is Ollie North and maybe the Barry Seal movie that Tom Cruise starred in, right? I think they called it. It was called Mina, but I think it ended up being called American Made. So here's the thing. So as we've sort of said, Iraq invaded, or they attacked, we should say. So I guess you can call it an invasion, Iran in September 1980. Now, remember, we still have our U.S. hostages there. That big hostage thing was going on. Iran was, it looked like this Khomeini was going to take over. It was like, there was a lot going on in Iran. It made a lot of people nervous. And Saddam Hussein goes in there and attacks it. This leads to the Iran-Iraq war. And the sort of benefactor of that war is Israel. They were very interested in that war to continue. Like, let's have these people fight each other, and we can try to stabilize whatever we've got to stabilize. So they had a lot of vested interest in that war, and they openly have stated all of this. Now, what did the U.S. have to do? What was Iran-Contra all about? Well, there were all these congressional rules that have been getting put into place of oversight, coming out of the Nixon era, coming out of the Carter administration as well, of, our intelligence agencies used to be able to do a lot of covert stuff, a lot of arms dealing, a lot of getting in, starting shit here and there and everywhere. And it was just sort of, there were some acts that came down, some amendments. A Bullen Amendment was specific to the Contras and a lot of stuff around Iran of, you're not going to no one gets to go in and just sell arms without Congress getting oversight. Well, this didn't fly well with people who in our intelligence agencies and the Reagan administration, who wanted to go ahead and do the deals that they saw were fit to do for what they perceived to be our national security. But Iran has our hostages. Reagan made a big deal out of this, right? He's coming into office, and this is the 80s. As early as the 80s, Israel was pushing arms to Iran, and Iran was in a position where they had a huge stockpiles of weaponry to fight this war with Iraq, but which they got from us. But they needed parts, they needed more shit, they needed help. They needed their military shored up for this war. And we had an embargo. And not only that, we were going around the rest of the world telling everybody, don't sell arms to Iran, don't do business with Iran. It was all this, no, Iran bad, don't give them arms, terrible, terrible. So there was a huge state push on that from our State Department. And then the Reagan administration didn't want to look like they were weak on the people who had the hostages. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Right? Reagan actually wants to, give Iran what they need for this war, apparently. And so a deal is worked out where Israel, this is a U.S. story, by the way. This is the U.S. version of this. There's an Israeli version of this. According to the U.S., Reagan was very concerned about a new hostage situation. We had hostages taken by Hezbollah in Lebanon. A bunch of nations did. And so he wanted to be very much the hostage freer guy, right? Like, I'm the president who's strong enough to get these hostages free.
I heard that before.
And thought that, I understand, there's a lot of echoes in this, and thought that, and it was widely considered, okay, Iran can help with Hezbollah. If we do Iran this favor and get them the arms that they need to fight this war with Iraq, then they'll in return help free these hostages, right? Help us with Hezbollah and get these hostages out of Lebanon. This is Reagan's story, that he went to the grave with this story. So everyone just remember, this is the story, is arms for hostages, right? Well, the only way to do that was to get around all these embargoes and all the State Department stuff out there. We were telling all these other nations don't deal with Iran, which is why it was so embarrassing, the Iran-Contra thing, is to sell the arms to Israel, and then Israel would get them to Iran, and they got them to Iran through our fucketeers, through Khashoggi and his guy who I cannot pronounce the name of, that you had just showed up there, right?
Yeah.
And that guy was charging like a 41% markup on this. This is how they make their money, right?
A lot of money.
Just a lot of money. It was a lot of money. It was $2 billion at that time. It was $2 billion in 1980. 81, $2 billion worth of arms going into Iran.
It's a ton of money.
Per year, right? And he's taken a 41% markup on that.
This is actually one of the things that really upsets me about this whole story, is these guys are getting so damn rich of pouring weapons into the Middle East, which lands up creating an impossible situation in the Middle East that no one can resolve, creates so much tension that it actually forces superpowers to then pour in even more weaponry into the zone. So you get these endless wars. So, this Epstein and this Maxwell and this Adnan and whoever else are busy making a mint of the death of American soldiers, basically, in the Middle East.
That's exactly, or other soldiers or innocent civilians. So they don't care. They're fucketeers. So this is what they're doing.
But it's insane. Why is this allowed?
It's insane. But let's come back to this. Yeah. So that's the U.S. story. That's what happened. We know we have people, the sort of official start of all this arms trading in terms of the U.S. There are folks that track that back to 1981. Well, here's the problem with the story. The hostages that Hezbollah had in Lebanon weren't taken until 1982. So that's hard to reconcile.
Inconvenient fact.
What are you doing? All right, so that's the Iran part of the story that doesn't pass the smell test at all. And by the way, all this stuff is going down, and Reagan involved in all of these things, and HW involved in all these meetings, and blah, blah, blah. The Secretary of Defense, was it Defense or State? At the time was Caspar Weinberger. And Caspar Weinberger, just know that he's taking copious notes in these meetings. This is like John Bolton, right? Taking all the notes. Just taking notes. And which was freaking everybody out, but he was taking his notes. Okay, so just put a pin in that. So what's the Contra side of it? In 85, Ollie North shows up, and he's like, hey, all this money we've got going on, right, in this arms deal, this secret arms deal to Iran, and we were making money off. There was money being made off of this. It was money being spent and money being made because Iran was paying.
Oh yeah, lots of money.
They were paying for it. So Ollie North comes in and was like, we got this thing we want to do over the Contras, but there's this Boland Amendment that's not that Congress has passed, and they're not going to let us do it. So why don't we take money from this Iran war and that we're making off these arms deals, and we'll use that money to fund the Contras. Now, the Contras were fighting the Sandinistas, who were democratically elected, however crazy all that is. It was Central American horseshit. And for whatever reason, Reagan comes into the White House on like day one pre any of this, Reagan's like, we must keep the Contras together, body and soul. He had a real hard on for the I don't know. We'll have to get into that at some other time. But so this was actually really important to Reagan, is to fund the Contras, and this is how, and to arm them, and this is how they could do that. So
that
that's
led
why
to a little bit
Iran,
of drug smuggling on behalf of
Right.
the CIA
That's-
involved in that.
That's the U.S. story of Iran-Contra. We know the arms dealers that were in the middle of all that, how they were getting rich, and Jeffrey Epstein's in the middle of that. Now, the Israeli side of this story is a little bit different in terms of a chicken egg. The Israeli side of the story is that Maxwell was actually instrumental at failing. And then pulling in the United States. So the Israeli side of the story, from what we can piece together, is that Israel reached out to the U.S., not the other way around. It wasn't the U.S. saying, "Hey, we want to free these hostages that haven't been taken yet, and so let's get Iran on our side." It was Israel saying, all these arms that we thought we were going to be able to arrange for Iran out of Poland, and they were spending their money too. Since 1980, they were putting money into this and trying to get arms to Iran, and they just needed help. And Maxwell was working with the Soviet Union to try to get them, lots of weapons, but the Iranians had weapons that needed American weaponry parts. It was a parts issue. And so Maxwell sort of fails on that. And then somebody, it's kind of unclear who, reaches out to the CIA and says, okay, maybe the CIA would want to help us with this. Right. Maybe they want to get involved in this, and they'll make some money. We'll make them a lot of money. And that's that side of the story. So everybody's got a different story about how it started and what it was really all about. But that's Iran-Contra. Everyone's in there. And then we'll come later when it gets exposed. It gets exposed in, and how it gets exposed. Let's come back to that. Let's keep going.
Eric had to go, by the way. He just had to jump off. So
I'm so sorry. John Tower makes a reappearance here in a big way around Iran-Contra, and we are introduced to Bill Barr officially.
Right. So we're going to do this a little quickly now because we have to jump through some time here. But all of this sets us up to a Cold War ending, which wasn't really an ending. It was sort of a faux thaw, if you want. It was sort of like we're going to pretend that we like America and that the Soviet Union is going to collapse, but it wasn't really what was going on. Greg?
The way that it happened was Ronald Reagan gave a speech where he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," and then the Soviet Union collapsed because Reagan said that. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's exactly what happened. It was just a quick speech, and tumbling down came the wall.
I think so. I think that's what happened. No, there was lots of things, thawing, as you say, during the 1980s. Glasnost and perestroika and these other words that they named underground clubs after in New York City at the time. And Gorbachev, Pravda. I've heard the Pravda.
Yes, that's a good name for the club.
Yeah. And you had, I think, in the Soviet Union for years, these really old, sort of decrepit, moribund premiers. And when Gorbachev took over, I think, he was a little bit younger. He was like a human being. He wasn't like this crazy Soviet old man leader of stereotype. And he and Reagan, I guess, got along okay, and they started to make these concessions. The other thing that was happening at this time was that the Soviet Union allowed the Jewish, the refuseniks to emigrate, to leave the Soviet Union. Right. Russia has been horribly anti-Semitic since at least 1888, when it was thought that the Jewish community was responsible for the assassination of the Tsar. And you had the pogroms and the Fiddler on the Roof era, which was horrible, all throughout. So Jews in the Soviet Union, which didn't allow religion, it was an atheist society, wanted to emigrate, especially to Israel after 1948, and were not allowed to do so, or were limited severely about how they could emigrate. They had to renounce they had to be unemployed in order to leave. But to be unemployed, they faced problems with, maybe they would get in trouble with and wind up in debtor's prison. There's all this stuff that were obstacles. And in the 80s, that began to be lessened, and Jews began to emigrate and leave the Soviet Union to come to Israel and to come to the United States. And the mafia, one of the things the mafia does that's so fucking awful is that they take things which are really nice and well-meaning, and they are parasites upon them. And one of the things that the mafia did in the Soviet Union was take this program where Soviet Jews were allowed to emigrate, and they kind of like hopped onto that, sort of like, they were stowaways almost in this thing. Some of them were pretty much atheistic, and maybe they had a Jewish ancestor, and they would write it on the card so that they could also leave and go to Israel, get a passport in Israel and go on, which is what Mogilevich did. Mm-hmm. He left the Soviet Union.
And it was Robert Maxwell who helped him with that.
Yes.
Not necessarily him personally, but for his men. And who all ended up landing in Trump Tower.
Right.
And
all
Trump's
of them.
properties.
I mean,
right.
Like a
yeah,
crazy.
That's why Donald knew. That's why he came down that escalator and said, Mexico's not sending their best. They're sending this, because that's what he facilitated and lived through. The KGB was also sneaking their guys in there too that were connected to the organized crime as well.
Maxwell's ownership of this whole period of time is fascinating, because he actually had Gorbachev on his payroll. He used to fund Gorbachev, according to Ben Menashe. So that is how Gorbachev was able to keep hold of the Communist Party. There was a lot of dissent at the time, but because of Maxwell's financial support, some of which came from the United Kingdom, he was able to keep Gorbachev in power. On top of that, you've got the connection to the mob bosses, but also he was a big proponent of the Refusnik program, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, along with some other prominent names we've discussed already. There was a lot of work to encourage these guys to come in, which if you were cynical and really suspicious, you would think, well, it's almost like they planned a operation that would make a situation for refugees to come in to America and hide within those refugees, as one would have in a Trojan horse or something, these sinister characters from the underground or from the intelligence services of Russia.
Well, I mean, don't put any active malevolence past, the KGB in that time. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, those people had to, they had to get out.
They had to get out.
They had to get out. So it's just what Greg just said. I mean, it's how what organized crime does, what the underworld does, right? The blend of hostile toilet op, intelligence, toilet ops, fucketeers, and gangsters, is they use our light to move with their shadows. Right. And that was, we all have, I don't know how many of us have family that thank God got out of there. But
people need to get out. There's no doubt.
That gets targeted and used. It's always going to be some act of good, especially if it involves the mass movement of people. It's going to be opportunists, and it's going to be capitalized on.
Mm-hmm. It's co-opted. It's the same exact. I mean, it's analogous to what's happening with the Black Lives Matter protests being co-opted by a very small amount of bad actors who have nothing to do with it. Take something that's really good and inspiring and just fucking ruin it, which is what these people do, and that's one of the reasons why they're so awful.
Now, another thing was happening at the same time. Jonathan Pollard was arrested. He was the first Israeli spy to be indicted. And because you love Alan Dershowitz so much, I've got a little clip for him from back then. Because guess what? Alan Dershowitz was Pollard's lawyer. So here he is.
Jonathan Pollard is a spy.
Absolutely. And he was justly convicted and justly sentenced to a term of imprisonment. That's what he deserved. But the idea that he should be treated as if he were a spy who had sold nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union, what did he do? He pleaded guilty. He fully cooperated. He helped the government in its damage assessment. He spied for a country which was an ally of the United States. He tried his darndest to give Israel only information which he believed was necessary to Israel's survival and would not jeopardize the interests of the United States. Those are not defense.
So that's not actually true, because in reality, Israel was helping the KGB all the way through this. And in fact, by this point, Maxwell had already become a spy for both. And it's unclear.
Let's talk about Pollard a little bit.
Yeah.
So, because people don't really know about this.
Right.
So Pollard has the same line, right?
Mm-hmm.
He has a quote. I'm going to read his quote. The American intelligence establishment collectively endangered Israel's security by withholding crucial information.
Mm-hmm.
So, end quote. So that's his justification. Dershowitz full bore on that. By the way, let's just talk about this for a second. Just for a second, right? This is you can't have it both ways again, right? You can't say that Israeli, when it comes to its intelligence officers, especially spy that they have in the United States, that gets caught,
mm-hmm.
that they don't care enough about that to also make sure that whoever the attorney is somebody that they vetted and is sort of with them.
There's
no way.
A friend of theirs, yeah.
He's going to get, this attorney is going to, whoever the attorney is for their spy is going to get all the information about what their spy did.
Of course.
There's no way that that's not going to be somebody who's also, they feel at least at the level of security with him, right? And then he ends up also being the attorney for Epstein?
And Donald Trump?
Oh, please.
I mean,
anyway,
it's
we'll get to that guy later. So Pollard's operation, his sort of main thing that he did, the thing that we know that he did, that it's all, that, and when I say we, I just mean people who look at this and can get public information, because a lot, again, is all redacted. Mm-hmm. He did get out. He was in naval intelligence. He tried to get into CIA. It didn't work out, and he went into he got into the naval intelligence, and there was a lot of issues around this guy. He had psych tests; they weren't great, but finally they let him in, and he starts. He really wanted in, right? Because he's a spy. Mm-hmm. So he gets in there. He's a mole, and what he ends up getting out is that we know of is a 10-volume manual on how the national security. How the NSA conducts signal intelligence. That's right. What he steals. He does this in 1984.
Yeah, it's a lot.
When Promise is going.
Mm-hmm.
And his handler is Rafi Atan.
Same guy who's handling Maxwell
Same
as
guy.
Well. Yeah.
Same guy doing Promise.
Mm-hmm. Same
guy with Maxwell, right? We did have this other spy, this mole for the KGB that was in the CIA named Aldrich Ames. And he accused Pollard of actually exposing our Knox, basically, I think. It was, in Russia and getting people killed. That was a big, huge allegation. So it does look like stuff was being thrown on Pollard that he perhaps didn't do.
Now, when you're sending your spies in to a country to build new territory, boy, it's nice to have an idea of what the signals intelligence looks like in that country. And it also might be useful technology you could use elsewhere.
Israel is helping us sell arms to Iran. While all this is going on, we're selling arms through them to freaking Iran.
Yeah.
And they're making money, and we're making money, and Adnan Khashoggi's making money, and everyone's making money off of poor Iran. I mean, horrible as they are, like they're just paying out the wazoo, for this war, because everyone's got their hand in that kitty. Everyone wants their take on that.
Yep.
So Israel, what does he mean? The American intelligence established collectively endangered Israel's security by withholding crucial information. You have Promise. You can see what we're doing? What are you talking about?
And still, it doesn't give you an excuse to spy on your ally. It's not really the way it works.
They're spying to leverage us. They're spying to leverage us and to have control over us because they're exposed too in this shit.
Well, there's also this move. I mean, if you look at Maxwell into Epstein as a two-part
take out the girls, and this is the same thing, right? Just take the girls out of Jeffrey Epstein, and he and Pollard are kind of right there with the same messaging, the same intent.
It seems
operating differently, but
it feels like there's
good.
an operation that spans decades and is ultimately still fulfilling the same goals. You've got, Maxwell doing his thing in the 1980s in the UK side. Here is Pollard supporting that with some intelligence work in the United States, and then Epstein picks it up afterwards. And while all this is happening, there's this on-the-ground hot war that's developing between the newly arrived Russian mobsters who are trying to chase away the Italian mob that has been ruling the roost in New York City. And it brings
they're
us
just
to
taking people out. Yeah. I mean, you got bodies in the street.
Yeah, you do. And here's one of them. In fact, let's look at Paul Castellano.
Yeah,
we'll talk afterwards.
Range. Castellano's bodyguard driver was
Gambino crime boss Big Paul Castellano was gunned down on his way to dinner at his favorite New York steakhouse. It was December 16, 1985. There hadn't been a mafia rub-out in New York City in over a decade.
They were shot numerous times with automatic weapons.
The five-family La Cosa Nostra had already been reeling from an unprecedented crackdown, led by the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, a young Rudy Giuliani, and his chief mob prosecutor, Michael Chertoff. So that takes us back a while. Do you want to talk a little about Paul Castellano and that whole move to basically knock out the Italian La Cosa Nostra?
Right. Well, the commission trials are going on. Castellano was indicted in that. That was taking out the heads of the five families. Tony Salerno was also involved in the. Giuliani was going after the heads of the five big families, and he had help from Italy from a prosecutor there, like sort of his counterpart there, a guy by the name of Giovanni Falcone, who was assassinated after this all got wrapped up. But what was happening in the broader world is that we did have this wave of Russian mafia coming in. There had been a sort of a boss already in Brighton Beach, sort of established there. Starting in the 70s, a guy by the name of Evsey Agron, who was very tiny in stature and also really scary. And he was, this is what we were just talking about, the Russian mafia that was coming in with that refusing program, they were terrorizing their own neighborhood, as happens. They were extorting, fellow Jewish emigres. It wasn't good. And there was a lot of blood. It was a whole other level of criminality crossing lines that sort of our traditional mafia, as horrible as they were, because that get glamorized a lot. I don't want to glamorize them, but the Russians crossed lines that our guys didn't cross. So anyway, this commission trial is going on. Let's take out all the heads. The reason why Paul Castellano that hit happens before he's I don't know whether he had any court cases yet, or his court cases started or not.
I'm not sure, actually.
I think
it was before.
He has a chance. I should look at all that. I have all that. But before he can go to jail or anything like that. And there was lots of reasoning behind, Gotti was the one that got named as doing the hit, but there were people who showed up with Russian hats on. The executioners all were wearing those stupid Russian hats. So whether that was to try to be the dumbest move ever by Sammy Gravano and John Gotti saying, oh yeah, we'll put our guys in Russian hats and then everyone will think the Russians did it. Because there were so many Russian mobsters. I don't think that was it. I think it was a signal. I think it was a tongue-in-cheek thing, but it also was like, this is who we're in bed with now, because everybody started doing deals together after Castellano's gone. Now, Castellano, the other thing to know about him as a crime boss, he was like 90 years old when they hit him. So he was old. He was around in the day, right? And he was big with Wall Street and racketeering. He liked that side of it, and he was really good at it. So he liked the moneyed side of the life. And if you're going to talk about an elegant gangster, this is an elegant gangster. So I find it fascinating that this guy, who was entrenched in Wall Street and entrenched in these sort of bigger financial rackets and really drawn to them, ends up being the one that they know, this guy we got to kill. We can't just take him out with a trial.
And he was the one who was resisting the deals with the Russians, if I'm not mistaken. The other mob bosses were doing business with them. Yeah. But this guy, he was not letting them.
There were quotes from Castellano where he was issuing some respect of like, oh, okay, they know how to make money, right? They're good at making money. He saw that, but he wasn't going to yield his territory.
No. And it's, looking at all of this in concert, you've got Maxwell working with Mogilevich. You've got Maxwell involved with this faux thaw of the Russian Soviet Union. And in comes this influx of immigrants, which also have Mogilevich's men and Russian intelligence men inside. And suddenly there's a turf war inside America's biggest city for who runs the town.
Right.
I mean,
and I should say with FC Egron, Egron was assassinated. I mean, there always had been attempts on his life. He was always getting shot, it seemed like.
Yeah.
He ran his operations out of the El Caribe Club, or El Caribe Club, which was Michael Cohen's family joint.
Oh, the lines are so close. I mean, Mogilevich is connected to everybody.
This is where you're like, are there generations of spies? There's definitely generations of gangsters. No doubt about it. So that's where FC ran his operation out of, and it looks like he was taken out. He was taken out within 6 months of Castellano in May 1985.
Right.
And he was taken out by his underlings as well because they wanted to take over. Now those guys that took over ended up partnering with Mogilevich, and we can directly tie them to him.
Yeah, there's a definite cause and effect. Taken out is such a nice term for being assassinated, but just noting that. No, it is a pretty pleasant term compared to what is this one? The rub out,
going away when you go to prison. He went away.
Yeah. So let's move on to let's go back to Maxwell in London. They have the Commonwealth Games, which is sort of the empire's version of the Olympic Games, but it's a disaster in 1986 because most of the countries around the world refusing to take part because of the UK's support for South Africa during the apartheid years and not wanting to ban any of their people. So there's a big crisis just before the start of the games, and in comes Robert Maxwell to save the day, finds the money somehow to fund the games and saves them, which is odd because he's a Labour, sort of supposedly Labour lefty-leaning politician. And lo and behold, he gets to meet the Queen. He claims for the first time, although I somehow doubt that it's the first time. So this is a magic little piece of tape I found in the Getty archives. This is
Queen wasn't
Robert
having
Maxwell.
any better luck with the weather. The cycling she was supposed to. The Queen wasn't.
Okay, so I'll just loop it because it's remarkable to see these two people together, and the ease with which they are together makes you really go, that's not proper protocol for the Queen. You don't normally approach the Queen like that. You don't normally walk ahead of the Queen. You wouldn't be so chummy with her, really. It's this, the whole thing about the crown is that it's built on ritual, and this does not seem like we're seeing any of that. Now, it may be that she's developed some over the years, but I would bet Mr. Maxwell and the Queen know each other better than we anticipate, particularly because it's her arms dealer who's doing the deals for Epstein and Iran-Contra from the British side. So it's interesting that they might have in fact known each other, and during that very heady time of 1986, actually had some time together.
I mean, what is she doing?
Good question.
Wasn't Thatcher at this point like, don't trust Robert Maxwell?
Thatcher was told, do not trust the guy.
Who is this guy, and what is this?
It's bizarre. It's bizarre. I mean, it's one thing if you're going to do this without the arms trade, fine. You can skip protocol. But you're doing this multi-billion-dollar arms trade in the middle of this, and your guy's involved?
Well, I mean, I guess clearly we get why her kid and his kid knew each other.
Right.
Their kids knew each other.
What we heard, yeah. Oh, yeah, with Ghislaine and Andrew.
And Andrew.
Oh, these guys are friends. These guys are close friends. Look at these photos. Could you mention that? But look at them. This is later on. This is in the 2000s. They're attending a wedding together. Yeah. This is post all the scandal stuff around Epstein. Epstein and Andrew obviously know each other from various things, including some arms trading, apparently. it just seems bizarre to me that this thing is just going on like it's everyday. It's everyday occurrence. Maybe it is an everyday occurrence.
I mean, all we're missing is Henry Kissinger in a chair. Like,
oh, it's just on the left side of that picture.
That's here's Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
No explanation.
It's bizarre to me that this goes all the way. There's a lot of questions still to be answered around what those arms deals were about and how much money was being spent for whom and why is anyone in like the British Crown involved in anything like this and what is their involvement? It seems uniquely important to understanding this whole story, especially considering Andrew can't get prosecuted for the crimes he's committed here. Oh, we're almost there. We're almost there. We're almost at the end of the Soviet Union. We get to 1987. Here's Donald Trump taking a visit to the Kremlin. He's basically being groomed. I don't know what you would describe it as, LB. I know you did some research on this. Which we should keep some of the story for the after show, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I'll do some story time reading.
Yeah,
I'll read from some passages about this. But yeah, no, he was targeted by the KGB. They show up at Trump Tower. He's like, hey, and they're like, hey, come. And then Ron Lauder. Then they're all together with Ron at Ron Lauder's dad's house having a party. Sitting next to each other. They're like, hey, that's cool. I want to do a tower. Cool. Do some towers, dude. And then from there, off he goes. Poof.
1987.
1986 is the party, and it's Natalia Dubina. I don't know if I'm saying it right.
Yeah,
he's the daughter of the ambassador.
Daughter of the ambassador.
Who happens to be sitting next to at the party.
That's right. He was coming out of the same directorate as that Khrushchev, I can't say his name, that was the other big KGB guy that was in charge of putting spies. All he did was go and get me some spies, right? That was his whole thing. Make spies, especially in America. And he was very focused on American businessmen, very focused on flipping American businessmen and turning them into operatives. That was his gig. So he sends his ambassador and the daughter, because they know enough to send the girl. And in they come and she's like, oh, I live in New York City. I want to show my dad around. Oh, look at this Trump Tower. Isn't this the most amazing thing you've ever seen? This is the story. This is how they describe it. So they walk in, breaking all protocol. We'll just go see who owns this building. Go up to his, and just walk in on Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah, anyone could do that.
Anyone could do that. Like any ambassador out of the KGB directorate for flipping spies is going to go do this. So they end up sitting down with him, and then they end up schmoozing a little bit later at a party together at the Lauder mansion, estate, whatever. And, who also was instrumental in the Refusnik program with Edgar Bronfman. And then poof, off he goes to the Kremlin.
Hey, do you guys know what day he flew to the Kremlin in 1987? Want to guess?
No.
Come on, July 4th.
What's that, 4th of July?
It's got to be 4th of July.
4th of July.
Because they have that kind of sense of humor over there. I mean, it's...
Also, I want to add something to that story about oh my God, Trump Tower is so wonderful. Having lived in New York for 10 years, Trump Tower is a shit building.
It is.
It's a shit building. It's ugly. Yeah. It's stupid. If you made the list of the top 100 buildings in New York, it would not be on the fucking list. Buildings that have long since been torn down are higher ranked than that.
Oh my God!
So the idea that they would be like drawn to that building is like that shit.
Yeah,
There's
right. These cover
no one who has
are
any
so
sense of aesthetics.
But he did know Maxwell by this time. He certainly knew Maxwell. I mean,
who did?
Trump.
He knew him by at least 2 years later.
He knew him but wasn't he? He knew Adnan. He was already doing stuff with Adnan.
Yeah, Adnan
he was hanging out. He knew all the guys connected to Maxwell.
He was living at the Olympic Tower in 1980 to 1983. He was living
in the Olympic Tower.
And then in 1989, he showed up at the yacht of Robert Maxwell, that big party that everyone's, what's Donald Trump doing here, which everyone thinks is the Iran-Contra after party, but it was actually the Maxwell death pre-party. We're gonna
kill him. Yeah. Everybody come.
Last chance.
And Donald is so stupid. He just shows up. He's just like, whoa.
And it turns
how do I get in on this arms trading?
They did.
He sees the money. He sees Khashoggi's money. He wants
all
that
he
money.
cared about was the money. Now he's stuck with this awful job that he has. But then he should have thought about that. So they did need a lot of spies. In fact, they potentially hired quite a few spies. later on, after Pollard and everyone was investigated, they discovered what they thought was a Soviet cell inside the Reagan White House. It came under the umbrella of Mr. X, and it wasn't just a Mr. X, it was several people known as Mr. X who influenced Reagan policy throughout that entire decade, not only in terms of refuseniks, but also in terms of limiting NATO's influence in Europe, and also this bringing down of the Soviet Union, which happened in 1991, just around the exact same time that Maxwell dies. And Maxwell dies spectacularly off a boat. And maybe, Greg, you can tell us a little bit about the ending there, because I know you wrote about it.
I'm going to go through a couple of quick things, because there's a couple points on Trump in Moscow that we did not hit.
Okay.
First of all, he's at the National Hotel in the Lenin Suite, which is absolutely bugged.
Yeah.
He's there with Ivana, so maybe he's not getting into too much trouble. But the idea that they didn't try to get at him, he's like the sort of things that the spies go after. Is it somebody who's vain? Is it somebody who's arrogant? Is it somebody who likes money? Is it somebody who's a pervert? He is all of them. Mm-hmm. They must have been like licking their chops when they saw this guy. So the idea that they didn't try is insane. When he returns from the trip a year later, he decides to explore running for president for the first time in 1988. Under the Reform Party, he hires Roger Stone, his old friend, to help him with this, and goes so far as to give a speech in New Hampshire at the behest of some idiot in New Hampshire who wanted him to come give a speech. And then he dropped out of the race. But before he went to Moscow, he did not have ambitions of running for any office at all, let alone the presidency. And he did not want to be governor. He didn't want to be mayor. He didn't want to be senator. He wanted to be the president, because, that's the biggest thing that he could be.
Yeah.
Well, and now
Maxwell,
who wanted him to be? Who does he say wanted him to do it? Who does he say? Do you have that in front of you?
No, that I don't have. You tell me.
Oh, should we save it for story time?
I
need my tequila.
Okay.
I'm ready for my tequila.
We can hold it.
We can save it for story time.
No problem.
Let's save it for story time. It's a great quote. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to go through the Maxwell stuff real quick. He actually, the death of Maxwell is a scene in my first novel, Totally Killer. And I think that I'm the only person who would ever write a sex scene involving Robert Maxwell.
Oh, yeah. That would be unusual.
Yeah, so there.
Especially his death.
I read it to prepare for, because I hadn't read it in a long time, and it's good. Anyway, it's funny. So he's on this yacht off the coast of Gran Canaria Island. It's November of 1991, or is it October? Whatever. It's the fall of 1991. It's 4:00 in the morning. He is naked. He goes up onto the last time the crew sees him is at 4:25 a.m. Supposedly, he liked to go naked to the side of the yacht and piss off it, which honestly, I would do the same thing if I were,
So what?
His dick is literally out.
His dick is literally out.
Yeah. We've come to that, and it's out. He's peeing over the side, and the thinking is that he falls off the yacht while he's midstream, and that's the end of him. Ghislaine Maxwell thinks that he's murdered. Yeah, the Mossad. Everybody seems to think it's a Mossad hit. Yeah. And that's the end of him. But what's interesting is he immediately, his body is taken to Israel. He's buried in state at Mount of Olives in the cemetery there, so he cannot be exhumed ever. There's no autopsy. The coroner's report is really sketchy. At his funeral, it's like a who's who of Israeli intelligence. I guess it's a continuation of the yacht party. Now without Maxwell peeing off his yacht to be at the party. And then within, 6 weeks of him dying or whatever, the Soviet Union formally dissolves on Christmas Day, 1991. Merry Christmas, USA, USA, USA.
USA gets to win. And in fact, you see the New York Times story there, just above the 1991 there, actually has two stories on its front page that day. One is the end of the Soviet Union. The other is the investigation into Robert Maxwell and how he stole 450 million pounds from the Mirror Pension Fund, when in fact, these two stories are so connected, it's impossible to report them separately. The New York Times managed to do just that on that day in 1991.
That was the other thing.
Amazing.
He was mid-Ponzi scheme when this happened. Like he had taken the money from the pensions.
Yeah.
Yeah. He had taken the money from the pensions to try to cover the losses. he had gotten in a fight with his son on the phone right before he died.
Right.
So everything is going to come out and ruin him, and then he dies. So it's all,
And some of the money, at least $800 million from the CIA money, apparently lands up with him, and that gets transferred to Epstein.
That's Iran-Contra stuff.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. Because I forgot to drop my Iran-Contra little markers along the way.
Yeah.
So that was money because the other problem with doing arms deals with nations that you're not supposed to be doing arms deal with, so you use intermediaries who seem like they're the ones who wanted the whole thing in the first place, and then you're making a bad excuse that you want hostages freed who hadn't been even taken yet. The problem with all of that is you got to hide that money. You got to hide the money you're making from this. So the other thing that we used Israel as a conduit for, or a parking lot for, was almost $1 billion, right? And they said, and that's what Maxwell had access to, and he had access to it in that what it looks like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Zev, it looks like what he did was he used it as if it was his own to secure flow of capital, streams of capital from other sources. So,
there's two stories. One is
$1 million over here, and so will you please fund my? He wanted to acquire shit. He was into buying more media properties and publishing.
He first used it as a loan guarantee, as you suggest, and then later on they tried to make another deal with him, and they did apparently expect him to pay it back to the CIA as a result of that deal, but he reneged on that. So apparently the money stayed with him, and ultimately, I think, went to Epstein through Hoffenberg's Towers Financial, and that's how it got laundered into the U.S. market.
That's how it got into Jeffrey Epstein's pocket. Right?
And how Jeffrey Epstein was able to fund his next operation, to do all the blackmailing and to do all that. He did with that CIA money.
He just simplified that all down and said, let's just get everybody on tape. Then I don't have to do what Robert Maxwell did.
Yeah.
So the complexities of it. Now, the other kind of important things to loop back around with this that are critical to it is I want to touch on Caspar Weinberger a little bit. So remember I said he was the one taking the copious notes, and right. So there were indictments in Iran-Contra. A lot of people were getting indicted, and there's jokes about who actually ended up going to jail and everyone gave Bill Barr this moniker of the cover-up general. But he's really, what he is a shutdown king. And I'd love to change that because it's a different way of thinking about what this guy actually does. So we have now, by the time this investigation into Iran-Contra and what it was all about goes all the way through the George H.W. Bush presidency. And it started with, there was what was called the Tower Commission, and Reagan started that. So when it all gets exposed, Reagan's like, oh yeah, I wanted to free hostages, but this sounds really bad. And like, there's a lot of corruption and I don't know about this Contra thing. And so I'm going to appoint somebody to investigate all that. And that'll be John Tower.
The same John Tower.
The same John Tower.
This John Tower here, this guy. There he is in the middle. This guy.
There he is. So Reagan's like, he'll get to the bottom of it. And that'll be it's like, imagine Trump picking somebody to do it. Corey Lewandowski is going to investigate, all the Russia. It's like that. It's like literally that. So that's happening. The Tower Commission, it's going to deliver its report. Then we get into the H.W. Bush administration, and let's go to Pollard for a second. So on the Pollard stuff, and now these guys have very big jobs, these secretaries, right? So there is lots of stuff going on that can be unrelated. But I found it a very interesting detail that it was Caspar Weinberger, who's the one in the Pollard case that revealed that he took the 10-volume set of signal intelligence out of the NSA. That was Caspar. That was
These guys
Weinberger,
are all connected. Right? I mean, there's no coincidence.
These guys are all connected. It's all happening at the same time. It's multiple ops on top of one another. Some of it could be separate. Who knows?
And same year, Senator Tower met his untimely death.
Same as the Tower. Yeah. Okay. So now we keep going.
Okay.
So we get into 91. HW still, he's running for a second term, right? It starts to become clear he's going to be a lame duck, right? In that process, in 91, I don't know if it was before or after Maxwell's death, John Tower dies in a plane crash.
It's before. I think it's in July. I want to say it's in July. But it's definitely earlier.
So he's gone. That's done. Maxwell's gone. That's done. But now we have a problem. Weinberger's still around and a whole bunch of other people, right, who are indicted, who know things about Iran-Contra, who kind of have the real story. And Weinberger being Casper being the real threat because why? He took all the notes. He was in the room of the room, right?
Yeah.
He's taking notes.
Don't take notes. It's not what we do in the middle of a scandal.
Oh my God. So, and he's indicted on obstruction of justice and some other charges. All right. So now we're in a lame duck presidency because HW loses the election, but he's brought in a couple of months before a new attorney general, Bill Barr.
That nice guy, Bill Barr.
Bill
Former
Barr comes in.
CIA analyst Bill Barr.
He gets in there, the AG. He gets his eyes and his grubby little fingers on all the evidence the Department of Justice has on all these people they're indicting involved in Iran-Contra, right? Then as soon as HW, I don't think they knew what they were going to do yet with all this stuff. But as soon as Bush Sr. loses that election, he's in his lame duck transition, they start pardoning. And Bill Barr is credited as the guy who gave the roadmap of pardons to HW. And the biggest pardon on the list was Casper Weinberger. Pardon this guy. So this is what Barr does.
Actually,
he shuts shit down. He gets to see what the evidence is. He gets his hands in there. He gets his eyes in there. And this is what's going. This was what was going on with Berman, I think, and all these guys. It's like we don't want you looking in on our investigation. What are you doing in here? And then you're going to fire me, or you're going to shut down this investigation. You're going to write your, first year, not even law school, paralegal letter about why Mike Flynn needs to be shut down, and you're going to pressure everybody that the president wants Roger Stone. They want that case tossed out or give him a light sentence or whatever it is he was doing with the Stone stuff that got revealed today. This is who he is. He's in there to get into these investigations, see what the evidence is, and shut shit down. That's what he does.
Exactly.
That's what he did in Iran-Contra. And every senator who was like, oh, he seems like a good guy, or he'll be an institutionalist, and everyone that used to work for this guy saying, oh, we think he'll be the right guy, who had a hope that maybe he'd get in there and the Department of Justice will just blah, blah. How is it that I know that he did this stuff, which is all in the public record around Iran-Contra, and these people couldn't figure it out? This guy corrupts investigations and shuts them down. That's what he does.
Yep. That's what he does.
To protect executive power. And he protects executive power specifically around executives who have everything to do with this arms trafficking ring of fucketeers that we are pulling apart and hunting down.
Yeah. And the reason Jeffrey Berman is no longer at the SDNY, make no mistake about it, is because he wasn't cooperating with Barr in at least one element of their discussions, which apparently involved de Blasio. But, you got to believe that if he's not cooperating on one level, he's probably not cooperating on some others. And Barr must not have liked that. So, I don't know. I don't have that much time for Berman. But on the other hand, he obviously was doing something to annoy and even scare the White House to, on a Friday night, fire the guy in charge of maybe 5 or 6 of the biggest investigations against the White House.
CNN reported today that this week they're going to have the Supreme Court's going to rule on the taxes. So I suspect that has something to do with it.
Those taxes.
There's the inauguration stuff. Berman was very vocal of like, even though Epstein's dead, we're not going to stop pursuing this case. And he was trying to get Andrew over to give some testimony.
The Epstein story, I think, is one of the critical things that has really upset both the White House and the Crown in the United Kingdom. There is no chance that they want to have any further exposure, whether it's for the sex crimes or the financial crimes or these arms crimes. The last thing the Queen wants to be hearing about is any of that. And I'm sure she still has her way.
I mean, she has someone else to hold her umbrella now, so why worry?
Yeah, who's holding the umbrella today? All right, so
I'm sorry to take a hit at a royal, but that was that video footage is shocking.
It is a little surprising. Now, they were just going to the games, but on the other hand, it seems very chummy. Very, very chummy.
I don't know.
That doesn't seem
She
right.
has to be chummy with somebody, though. I mean, she can't just sit in the, right? I mean, she has
her
to have
arms
somebody.
trading guy. That would be the person to do it with. We're going to stop right here because we have now taken up way too much time. But we're going to do it a little bit longer on a separate post show. Is that correct? So you're still both into it?
We could do it. I don't know how much is left. I've already into my tequila.
Oh, okay. Well, if you're done your tequila,
But let's do it.
Well, if there's not much to go with, we can stop here. Up to you, Greg, if you feel like a post drink.
I'm fine either way. I mean,
Well,
it's a long show.
It's a long show. I didn't realize it was going to be this long. It turns out to be a very long show.
If we are going to wrap, I want to circle back to one thing about Bill Barr, because I think Bill Barr is kind of a through line here, and probably there's something connecting him and Epstein that we haven't quite hit on yet, that I suspect is going to come out and be more obvious. But, LB, to your point about him being the shutdown king, it wasn't just Iran-Contra. It was Inslaw. It was BCCI.
Yes.
It was the other bank. And what's interesting, the other bank, the Bank of Roma, where they busted the guy and the Atlanta branch manager. These banks, what was interesting, the way that they got caught is John Kerry, when he was a senator, kept going after it. And eventually he got the state to press charges against it, which is exactly what is going to take Trump down when New York State, does an end around the federal government to try to go after him. I thought that was interesting when I was reading.
Really interesting.
Anywhere the money is, that guy shows up and shuts it down.
And by the way, Inslaw is promise. So when you're talking about shut down things related to Maxwell, we started off the show talking about promise. That investigation was shut down by Barr. Iran-Contra, which also involved Maxwell, was shut down by Barr. And now here we are again with something else being shut down by Barr related to Maxwell. So it's a bit of a thread you can't ignore.
Can't ignore it.
All right, gents. Only one of you, because we lost Eric.
That's okay.
You can be a gents too, can't you?
Yes, I can.
You sure
I have
can.
the mouth of a sailor, I've been told.
Well, sometimes you let us see that, but not very often. So thanks very much, guys. It's been a really interesting show. I think we learned a lot today.
Thank you. And
it all turned into a podcast.
You guys have been great, by the way. These shows have been really important, and I've learned a lot listening to them. And it's really amazing. Just keep up the good work, is what I say.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for that. And we're big fans of Prevail as well. And thanks for the piece today.
Yes.
And everyone should find you. Where should they find you?
Yeah, I love your newsletter. It's the one thing that comes, and I'm not kidding with this. I've never said this to you, but when I forget what day of the week it is. I can't keep track of it anymore. Everything's a blur. And then I'll see the Prevail, Greg, and I knew you were working on this, but I hadn't read it. So I didn't really know what was going to be in it. It showed up in my email this morning when I woke up, and I was like, oh, this, I'll read this email. The rest of it, I'm not reading. This one.
He's a must read.
I can't stand all the email I get, but I'm so glad I'm just saying this genuinely. I'm so glad I signed up for that. So I recommend everybody get.
Where do they sign up, Greg?
You can go, if you type in my name and Prevail, it will pop up. Or on my Twitter page, there's a link to it. Awesome. And I update every Tuesday and Friday. And on Sunday, we have something lighter and fun and not horrible to report about.
Wow. How do you do that? Yeah. Got to teach us how to do that. Thanks, everyone. Again, if you can join us on our next show, we'll continue the story. There's at least one more, I think, of these. And also, if you want to or need to or can, patreon.com/narrative is how we fund Narrative for as little as $5 a month. That's all it takes. And it's great to have all the new subscribers who've been joining us in the last few months. That's all from us. Hope you have a great night. Good night. Oh, it's not the tape. I'll just go.